أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين. Verse number 7 of Surah An-Nisa. للرجال نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون وللنساء نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون مما قل منه أو كثر نصيبا مفروضا. Men have a share in the heritage left by parents and near relatives, and women have a share in the heritage left by parents and near relatives, whether it be little or much, a share ordained by Allah. Now from this verse we proceed to see the verses about inheritance, the shares, different layers of relatives who have a share in their heritage and related matters. Now the first thing that we have to consider about this verse is that this is something quite shocking for the audience of the time. They didn't have any idea of shares given to women and given to children, young children. So the way it is actually expressed by emphasizing it without using a pronoun. You see, it says, لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ. For men, there is a share of heritage left by parents and near relatives. And it could have said for women the same, but it wanted to emphasize so that the listener can actually understand the depth of the matter. لِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ, repeating instead of using a pronoun, which means this was something very important. Actually, the Arabs didn't have this custom of leaving heritage for women and for young children. They said, of course, young children, well, they are negligible. Why should they receive any heritage? And women as well, that they didn't have any right of property, let alone any right to inheritance. So here, this verse is actually abrogating, neglecting the long-standing custom of inheritance of the audience of the verse. And that's why it was quite shocking, unfamiliar for those who had to hear it for the first time. Allama Tabatabai Rahmatullah Alai has a very interesting view here. It says that this idea that women and young children should not inherit anything had become like a second nature of people. It was so obvious for them that anyone saying something against it would have been very difficult to accept. He says, therefore, the Prophet, peace be upon him, by receiving the Quran, used a two-step process to abrogate this idea. First was the idea that he actually established brotherhood between Muhajirun and Ansar, and then said that Muhajirun and Ansar, those who have become brothers with one another, they inherit from each other. So the idea that inheritance should only go to the mature male relatives of the deceased was weakened. And after this, then it was abrogated and a new ruling came, which was not so stunning for the people because, of course, the foundations of the previous ruling was weakened by this idea of inheritance between brothers, Muhajirun and Ansar, brothers in that sense. So this was, of course, this idea of inheritance between Muhajirun and Ansar was abrogated in Surah Al-Ahzab. وَأُولُو الْأَرْحَامِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلَى بِبَعْضٍ فِي كِتَابِ اللَّهِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ. The relatives, the close relatives, have, of course, priority over this brotherhood, Muhajirun and Ansar. إِلَّا أَن تَفْعَلُوا إِلَىٰ أَوْلِيَائِكُمْ مَعْرُوفًا. It means that there is no such a thing anymore. You can, of course, give them some share from the third, but ulul arham are important. And here it is categorically saying that ulul arham, being male or female, young or old, should have a share of inheritance. And this was actually established at a time when there were enough mu'minun to respond positively to it and to accept it. You know, it's very difficult to somehow make the foundations of certain customs, shaking the foundations of certain customs is very difficult. And then this idea, which is mentioned at the end of the verse, مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ, whether it's little or a lot, small amount or big amount, there's no difference in that. Is actually saying some people would have said that, okay, I mean, if the heritage is little, then why should we bother about all these shares and things like that? And sometimes they thought, if the heritage is so big, should we really give a share of that, a big chunk of it, for example, to women? That was something that they couldn't think about. They couldn't imagine that they give such a share to women. So this emphasis here, مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ, emphasizing the idea that this must be done. And then with the other sentence, نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا, this has been legislated for you. It is compulsory on you. You have to follow it. It's not just a sort of advice. It's a legislation legislated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, some Shia commentators, of course, have argued here against what Abu Bakr said regarding the heritage of the prophets. The argument he brought against Fatima al-Zahra and Amir al-Mu'minin alayhim as-salam, that the Prophet said that we, نحن معاشر الأنبياء, we, the groups of Anbiya, the prophets, would not leave any heritage. What we leave is knowledge, for example, or what we leave is sadaqah. Now, they have said that this verse is very clear. It has not excluded anyone. Of course, prophets, as prophets, they do not have any, if, for example, Baytul Mal, the public treasury is under their authority, that is going to be inherited by the community, by the public. But their personal property would be included in this verse. That's لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ, and it has not وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ, it has not excluded anyone. It includes the prophets, awsiya, anyone who is a human being, could be regarded as woman and man, is included in this. And they have said, so what that argument by a hadith, which is of course a hadith not very much, not strong enough to stand against such a verse, so the argument is flawed, and the prophets are under the same general ruling here. Verse number 8, وَإِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةَ أُولُو الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ فَارْزُقُوهُمْ مِنْهُ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. And when the division is attended by relatives, the orphans and the needy, provide for them out of it and speak to them honorable words. Now, apparently, what happened when someone passed away, the wasi of that person would gather the relatives who had a share in the heritage, and then would have, according to the ruling of the Quran, would have divided the heritage between them. Now, maybe some of other relatives who knew that this person was rich and has left lots of heritage after himself, they attended the procession, or they were invited to just be a witness. And if they were not well-to-do, of course, they should have been felt that they wished that they had some share in this inheritance because they were relatives. Of course, not relatives who had a share, but relatives who are farther from taking shares. Now, here it says that if they are there, إِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةَ أُولُو الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ. Ulul Qurba means relatives who are needy, certainly, or relatives who do not have any share. And Yatama and Masakin of the relatives, those who are orphans and needy among the relatives. Of course, some commentators have said that it includes every needy person, but most of the commentators say that, first of all, usually not everyone attends. People who are invited to witness are usually relatives. So all of these Yatama, Masakin, orphans and needy are referring to Ulul Qurba, among Ulul Qurba. So when they are there, فَارْزُقُوهُم مِّنْهُ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Provide for them out of it and speak to them honorable words or kind words, قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. So the commentators in Majmu' al-Bayan says, Ulul Qurba means فُقَرَاءُ قَرَابَةَ الْمَيِّتِ. So those relatives who are needy. And they sometimes come in such gatherings, come to see if something is given to them as well, because the person was rich, lots of wealth was left behind. And also he says, Yatama wal Masakin means Yatamahum wa Masakinuhum. The orphans from among the relatives and the needy among the relatives. Now, is this something obligatory on the heirs to do such a thing? Does this verse at all continues to have any effect after the shares have been legislated? Some commentators say that this verse has been abrogated by the verses who clarify the shares of the heirs, that each heir should take such and such amount, and there is no room for other relatives to take anything. For example, if there are children and parents, then there's no room for cousins or uncles to have any share. So this verse has been abrogated. But this is very unlikely, because this verse has been placed here or revealed immediately after the verse about the shares. So it cannot be something abrogated. And it cannot be obligatory, because the shares have been already delineated and nothing has been defined here. So it is something mustahab, something which is liked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be done, rather than something necessary. So there is no room for saying that this has been abrogated by the verses about the fara'id, the shares of all each member of the heirs, among the heirs. And there is no room to say that this is obligatory. But this is something which has been instructed by Allah. And it is very important to be taken heed of. In Majmu' al-Bayan, he alludes to what I mentioned. He says that اختلف الناس في هذه الآية على قولين. People have disagreed and have been parted in two different views. One is that أنها محكمة غير منسوخة. This is a muhkama, a firm verse. It hasn't been abrogated, and he says that this is the idea which Abdullah ibn Abbas, Sa'id ibn Jubair, Ibrahim, Mujahid, Sha'bi, Zuhri, and also it's reported from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and Mu'tazili commentators like Al-Jubbai, Al-Balkhi, and Akthar al-Mufassirin wal-Fuqaha, the majority have said this is not abrogated. The other view, which is taken by a minority of the commentators, they say this is mansukha, and those who have said it is muhkam, that means it's not abrogated, they have disagreed whether this is wajib or mandub, which I mentioned the view of the Aksar al-Mufassirin, majority of the commentators. Now this verse, compare this verse with the verse that we discussed in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 180. كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتِ إِنْ تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. It is written upon you that when you feel that the death is close, then if you are going to leave behind a considerable wealth, you have to make some sort of wasiyah or will for parents and relatives. Now, if you remember in that, about that verse, we also discussed the idea that some say that this is abrogated because now the shares have been clarified. So there's no need for a will for walidain and aqrabun. But we narrated from A'imma alayhimus salam, and of course many or all Shia Mufassirin who say that this is not abrogated. It is something instructed by Allah, not as an obligation, but as something which is liked by God. It's mustahab to do this. But the difference is, this is about the mayyit, the deceased, who is going to die. It is good to leave something, to make a will for those who do not inherit among the relatives, or even those who inherit among the relatives but are in more needs. So from a third of the heritage, he could actually make a will for them. Here, this is not about the person who is passing away. It's about the awsiya, those who are dividing the heritage between those who have a share in it. This is an instruction for them that you have to give something. The way the Quran is emphasizing this matter shows that we really need to, if a person is dying and is leaving something behind considerable, should not be negligent of those needy relatives who do not have any share of that inheritance. Make a will about it. And even if he hasn't made a will about it, the heirs and the wasi, the one who is actually giving the shares, must consider to give something to the relatives who are in need, even though they don't have any share of the inheritance. Now, what is the application of this in our today's life? Now, with regards to the deceased, the person or the person who's passing away, is very clear. He can remember that he has an aunt or uncle who are in need and can make a will that, for example, after I die, up to a third of course, the wealth. You can give, I instruct you to give such and such to that cousin, to that uncle, to that sister, although they are not among the heirs. This is, of course, something, as Allah says, حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. This is a right that the muttaqin must uphold. Now, after that, nowadays, of course, the wills are read and everything is distributed automatically by the by the solicitors, things like that. But it is also good that when this is being done, the heirs invite poorer relatives and give something to them as well. Or even, of course, it says, إِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةِ, when they witness, when they are present in the distribution, it's good to invite them and read the wasiyah, or if there's no wasiyah, the solicitor come and say, this is the time, that this is how the shares are being distributed. And then every person who has a share may say, okay, I want to, this much of my inheritance go to such and such person. This is something which would actually bring barakah to society. We should not be negligent of these matters. This brings barakah and blessing to our community if we do such things. Now, at the end of the verse, it says, وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. First of all, do not rebuke them. Why are you here? You have no share in inheritance, for example. You shouldn't be present here, or things like that. But it's more than that. Sometimes it's not possible to give a share to the relatives because the heritage goes to young children who cannot decide about their wealth themselves. They haven't come to age of maturity. And in that case, of course, the wasi must explain to these people who are poor, needy relatives who have attended, telling them that, look, for example, this belongs to young children. I have no authority to give anything out of it. But I advise them when they are mature, for example, to give a share for you. Some things like, in these ways. So speak to them kind words. So would be when the legal inheritors are minors, in which case the guardians should preserve their inheritance until they mature. They cannot give anything. So in these cases, they should speak kind words to other needy individuals who may expect donations. Kind words is always in itself is a sadaqah. We have to bear in mind that kind word is in itself a sadaqah. Verse number 9. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضَعَافًا خَافُوا عَلَيْهِمْ فَلْيَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَلْيَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. Let those fear the result of mistreating orphans, or otherwise that I will explain, but let's do not put any brackets here. Let those fear who were they to leave behind weak offspring would be concerned on their account. Let those fear who were they to leave behind weak offspring would be concerned on their account. So let them be wary of Allah and let them speak upright words. There are three different views about this verse. This is actually a bit thought-provoking verse, especially in the context that it is placed. And sometimes people have ignored the context. Majority of the commentators have ignored the context and have actually given a view which is more probably not correct. Most probably not correct. Now, one view is that here is talking about awliya of the orphans, the guardians of the orphans, that they have to preserve their property. They should not mistreat them, and they should not mistreat the property that they have, in the same way that they wish, they desire that others do with their orphans if they leave any orphan behind. So this view is reported from Ibn Abbas, who says that what's meant by the verse is that the guardian of the orphan must treat him in a way that if he would have left some orphans behind, he would have liked others to treat them. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضَعَافًا مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضَعَافًا خَافُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. So, in other words, he says that you never know. You might be next. If you see the orphans of others, remember that your children might become orphans too. So be careful about that. Just as you would want others to treat your orphans kindly and generously, you can't treat other orphans. Be fearful about your own orphans. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضَعَافًا خَافُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. This is one view, and there's a narration from Imam al-Sadiq or Imam al-Kazim alayhi salam, who says that God has made two threats for consuming the property of orphans. One in the hereafter and one in this world. The worldly punishment is let those fear. He actually mentioned this verse. It means that they should fear that God may do the same to his offspring as he did to the orphans. This is one view which is mentioned. And of course, there is some discussion around this idea of punishment going to the children. If someone does wrong, then the punishment going to the children of that person. We'll discuss this later, maybe next session. Let me explain other views here about this verse. The other view is what is mentioned again by Majma' al-Bayan, that when a person was on the moment of death, or the death was close, the companions of the prophets would go to him and would say that, look, you have lots of wealth, and or a considerable amount of wealth. You want to leave it for your children. If you leave it behind, the children will share it amongst themselves. But you think about yourself, your hereafter. So give all that to charity. Your children wouldn't do anything for you. They wouldn't have any khair, any good for you. On the day of judgment, you would not know each other in a sense. So give at least, the considerable amount of your wealth for charity. Here, this is not liked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It says that, what if you are leaving children behind who especially are in need? Would you like to give all your inheritance to charity? Because sometimes we have this idea, and sometimes we hear it from the pulpit, and we have in many narrations as well. Give what you have before you die and don't leave it for your children. This is when the children are not in need. But when the children are in need, when they don't have a dwelling place, when they don't have a job, for example, and you want to give everything in charity, of course, that's not right. And some people who were, in a sense, religious in that sense, feeling to be very religious, okay, give everything in charity. He said, would you like this to be done to your own dhurriya, children, if you are going to die? So those who are leaving weak children behind, immature other children, and they are in fear that they may be without any provision, they must advise the wasiyah in a way that something is left for the children as well. Of course, up to a third is fine. the person, in fact, is telling why this idea of shares is actually in place. Yes, sometimes we are old, all our children have their own houses and pleasure and leisure and everything. They are not in need. Yes, of course, it's good to give that in charity to those who are in need or to relatives who are in need while we are alive, rather than leaving for the children who just become a bit richer. But if there's dhurriya, if the children are weak, it is certainly mustahab to leave something behind for them. Even if we try hard to have something during our lifetime, so that if they are in need, they are not left in need after we pass away. And the third view is أنها وردت في حرمان ذوي القربى أن يوصى لهم بأن يقول الحاضر لا توصى لأقاربك ووفر على ورثتك. That the person wants to make a will that a third of his or her inheritance goes to needy relatives who are not part of those who take a share. And someone comes and says that, no, why you do that? Leave all of that for your children who take a share. So this is the third view. We need to elaborate on this a bit further. So we leave the discussion about this for our next session, inshallah. So we had three views on this. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضَعَفًا خَافُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. Now, what the context requires here is the second view, not the first view. Because if it was about the orphans, it should have come before the whole subject of inheritance, which has come in light now. It should have been placed before that. I will inshallah discuss this further in our next session. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.